Hi boys and girls, welcome back to you and also to your parents. Today's video is called Comparing Bar Model. Now boys and girls, I know we've already talked a lot about comparing bar models, but today this video is for you to watch with your parents and so that they can help you at home whenever you have trouble with your homework. Okay? So if your parents have any questions during the video, you probably know the answer. Okay? So today you're kind of like the teacher to your parents. Okay? So before we get started, we're going to talk about some of the vocabulary that we've been learning in some of our other videos. The first vocabulary word is parts. In a bar model, there are always two parts, and those two parts create one whole. Okay? Labels. We always label our bars with words, and we also label them with numbers. And we also label one of our bars a question mark, okay? Because that's going to be our problem that we need to solve. Next is we use brackets to help us solve, or we use brackets to label the parts with numbers, okay? And then today we have two new words, comparing and difference. I'm going to be using I'm going to be using these two words a lot today. I'm going to be talking about them. So a comparing bar model is basically when you have two items that you're looking at and you're comparing them. And when you compare them, a lot of times we are talking about the difference. We are also sometimes talking about how they're the same. But in comparing bar models, we're looking at difference between two items. Okay? So, also, since this bar model is different than the other ones, I created some steps that if you follow, it will make it easy for you to do a comparing bar model, okay, as long as you follow these 7 steps. And we've talked about these steps in class before. So number 1 is read the real world problem. Number 2, decide which is more or less. Number 3, label with words. Number 4, label with numbers. Number 5, label the question mark. Number 6, ask yourself what's missing, a part or a whole. Number 7, if a part is missing, you subtract. If the whole is missing, you add. Okay? So before we actually do a real world problem, I'm just going to talk about the basic elements or the basic parts of a comparing bar model. Okay? So I'm showing you a really simple, easy bar model with easy numbers. Okay? So here, if you notice, we have 2 bars. One bar is bigger than the other bar. We are comparing 2 things. We are comparing oranges and we are comparing apples. We have 6 oranges and we have 2 apples. Okay? Here we have a bracket in an empty space. There is no bar there. However, this bracket is labeling the difference between the oranges and the apples. So here you can clearly see the difference between them is 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, so the difference between 6 and 2 is 4. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and write that here. The question mark here should be 4. Okay, this is a very basic comparing bar model. Alright, so one thing that I want you to remember is that this empty space here represents the difference between the 2 bars. Okay, that's the main thing that I want you to remember for today. The next thing that we're going to do is we're actually going to do a real world problem. Okay, so let's follow our steps so that we can do our problem. So step number 1 is read the real world problem. Okay, so I'm going to read it. Mary has $345. Okay, Mary has $114 less than Ellen. Okay, how much money does Ellen have? All right, so I just did step number 1. Step number 2 says decide which is more or less. Decide which is more or less. So I am comparing how much money Mary has, and I'm comparing how much money Ellen has. So I need to decide which one of those two girls has more money or less money. So I'm going to read this again. Mary has $345. Mary has $114 less than Ellen. This right here tells me, says Mary has $114 less than Ellen. So that means that Mary has the bar that is less. She has less money than Ellen. And Ellen, we're going to label the big bar Ellen. Good. So I've just done now step number 3, which is label with words. And I've decided which one's more and which one's less. My next step is number 4, which is label with numbers. So if I read my problem again, it says Mary has $345. Okay. So we already know how much money Mary has. Perfect. Here we go. Now, the next part. Mary has $114 less than Ellen. This could be a little bit confusing. You might read this and say, Mary has $114. That's not true. We already know Mary has $345. What it's telling us is that Mary has $114 less than Ellen. So this part right here is telling us the difference, this empty space here. That sentence is telling us the difference between Ellen and Mary. Okay? And our question says, how much money does Ellen have? So that means we don't know how much money Ellen has. So the question mark goes to Ellen. Okay, so now our bar model is set up. We are now on step number 6, which says, ask yourself what's missing, a part or a whole? Well, let's look at our bar model. Here at the bottom, you have 2 brackets. This is bracket 1, bracket 2. And on each bracket, there's a number already. It's already labeled. So those are my 2 parts. So a part is not missing. But if I look at the top, I notice that this is my whole. This is my whole. And I don't know what my whole is. So that means if I don't know what my whole is, then that means I have to add. So that means I'm adding these 2 numbers to find how much money Ellen has. So notice here that I did not make the decision of whether to add or subtract until I set up my bar model. That's one thing that I really want you guys to remember, is that please do not decide if you're going to add or subtract in the beginning. Set up your bar model first. Once you set up your bar model is going to tell you whether you have to add or subtract. Okay? Especially because these real-world problems can be very, very tricky. For example, here it says Mary has $114 less. This right here was giving me a clue that perhaps I had to subtract. But as you can see now with my bar model, I don't have to subtract. Okay? I actually have to add. So be very, very careful when you're reading your bar model, because sometimes the stories will trick you. Okay? So again, I remind you, please set up your bar model first, then decide whether you have to add or subtract. So the last thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to show you my work. So let's see, 345 plus 114. Oops, don't forget your addition symbol. I'm adding those together, so 5 plus 4 is 9. 4 plus 1 is 5. And 3 plus 1 is 4. So, Ellen has $459. Okay? What I want you to remember from this is I want you to remember that. Please read your bar model story very carefully because it can be tricky. Okay? Just because it says less doesn't mean you have to subtract, and if it says more doesn't mean you have to add. That's why it's important to please set up your bar model first. Okay? We're going to do one more bar model, real world problem, I'm sorry. And again, remember, the words in your story can be a little bit tricky, so we have to set up our bar model first before we decide if we're adding or subtracting. So step number 1, Jack has $278. Bill has $121. Okay, how much more does Jack have? This is another tricky one, because look here, there's a clue. Perhaps it says, how much more does Jack have? That word more might make us think, we have to add. Okay? But remember, don't decide if you're adding or subtracting yet until our bar model is ready. So let's get our bar model ready. Number 1, read the real world problem. Okay, I already did that. Number 2, decide which is more or less. Okay? Jack has $278. Bill has $121. Okay, that means Jack is the bigger bar because he has more money, and Bill is the smaller bar, because he has less money. This is Bill. Okay, let me delete this. Okay, so we have now done step number 3, which is label with words. Now we're going to do step number 4, which is label with numbers. Let's see, let me read the problem again. Jack has $278. So I'm going to label Jack $278 and Bill has $121. So, good, there we go. Then it says, how much more does Jack have? They want to know the difference between them. How much more does he have? So our question mark goes at the difference. They want to know how much more he has. Okay, so our bar model is now set. Okay, now we need to ask ourselves, what's missing? A part or a whole? So let's look at our brackets at the bottom here. Here we have 2 brackets. These are our parts. And we have this bracket that's labeled. This bracket, we don't know what this bracket is. That's the question mark. But we do know what this big bracket at the top is. So we have our whole, but one of our parts is missing. We don't know what this part is. When that happens, when one of our parts is missing, you subtract. So, remember our clue up here that said how much more? And we thought, well, maybe that means we have to add. See, this is very tricky. We actually don't have to add. We actually have to subtract. So again, I remind you, it's very important that you set up your bar model first before you decide if you're adding or subtracting. So my last step that I'm going to do is I'm going to show you my work. So I'm going to do 278 minus 121. Oops. So that would be 8 minus 1 is 7. 7 minus 2 is 5. And 2 minus 1 is 1. So that means that Jack has $157 more than Bill. Okay? Thank you so much, boys and girls, for watching.